Today, that is Tuesday, September 27th, Japan bids farewell to its assassinated former leader Shinzo Abe with a rare state funeral. And Korean Prime Minister Han Duck-soo is heading a delegation there to extend condolences and to meet with Japanese Premier Fumio Kishida. So why has Abe's state funeral divided the Japanese public? What are the prospects of Seoul-Tokyo ties following recent talks at the leadership level? And does the current climate of geopolitical uncertainties look to provide a platform for improved bilateral ties? Welcome to yet another edition of Issues and Insiders. The leaders of South Korea and Japan sat down in New York last week on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and today a delegation led by Prime Minister Han Duck-soo is attending former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's state funeral. For more bilateral ties, I have Professor Kim Hyun-wook at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
I also have Professor Yoshihide Soeya at Keio University live on the line as well. Professor Soeya, it's good to have you with us.
Yeah, good to be with you. Yeah, thank you.
Right, Professor Kim, let's start with a few words on last week's talks between President Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Do you suppose this summit, short as it was, signals the start perhaps of some progress with regard to efforts to enhance bilateral ties?
Yes, but this was a very short meeting, so two leaders might not have enough time to talk in detail about urgent issues. But important thing is that this summit meeting has been vacant for 2 years and 9 months. So I think the meeting itself is meaningful. And I think two leaders talked briefly about key issues like they agreed upon the need to revert the relationship back to normal, and also mentioned that forced labor issue should be solved very urgently. And also, some of the issues they talked was that President Yoon's approach towards the South Korea-Japan relationship is grand bargain based approach, which means that all the issues should be on the table together. But this is meaningful, but I think details needs to be talked and discussed. Still a lot of homeworks.
Right, of course. Many are claiming it was just a start, of course. Having said that, Professor Soeya, what has been the response in Japan with regard to the talks between Yoon and Kishida, and how do you explain the conflicting earlier reports with regard to the planned summit between the two countries?
Yes, the earlier report sounded a bit bizarre to me. Two leaders meeting and each side is emphasizing somewhat differently the importance of this. And I think it was somewhat symbolic of the current state of the relationship between the two administrations. South Korean side is very proactive, very enthusiastic. I mean, in their sending messages to Japan as well as, taking a few domestic measures as well. And the Prime Minister Kishida himself still captive of the so-called, legacies of conservative, politics in the Japanese, domestic politics. I think this was all about. This is all what happened. But finally, I mean, the meeting itself happened, and I think that itself is very important. And I understand the meeting itself was not very bad. I mean, conducted in a friendly fashion. And if the leaders meet, then this creates a certain environment in which practitioners feel a little easier to, to talk to each other. And so in that sense, I mean, it has positive element, but still, both sides or the relationship between the two administrations is still bothered by the legacies of the past years.
Right. Moving forward, Professor Kim, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo is in Tokyo as we speak, attending former Japanese leader Shinzo Abe's state funeral. That being said, what can you share with us about bilateral ties under the former Abe administration?
We know that former Prime Minister Abe is a very conservative person. He regularly went to Yasukuni Shrine. So I think this was a dormant problems between Japan and Korea. But more than that, I think the critical event that made the relationship to a negative direction was, the former South Korean President Lee Myung-bak's visit to Dokdo in 2012. It was his last year, and that made the relationship very much into a negative response. And afterwards, during the Park Geun-hye government, the relationship was not very good, and Obama government's attempts to make the relationship better was not really successful because he could not understand, the Obama government's people visiting Japan and Korea to reconcile the relationship was not really based upon historical understanding. So that made more and more backlashes in Japan and in South Korea. So I think in overall, I think the relationship went very well under the Moon Jae-in government with comfort women and forced labor issues, which were verdicted at the Supreme Court in South Korea. I think a diplomatic issue should be solved diplomatically first. But when he went to the Supreme Court, I think this becomes much more distorting the relationship. It's not easy to make the relationship back to normal. So I think maybe Prime Minister Kishida a little bit dovish than compared to the Prime Minister Abe. So we hope that we can find better ways to make the relationship better.
Right, hopefully, of course. Meanwhile, in Japan, Professor Soeya, I hear Mr. Abe's state funeral has divided the Japanese public. Do you care to elaborate?
Well, before getting into the subject, please allow me to express my deep condolences to the tragic passing of the late Prime Minister Abe. Incidentally, I'm watching right now the internet, program of the state funeral, which started at 2 o'clock. But anyway, having said that, I think the division of the society in response to the Kishida's, decision to hold the state funeral is Abe himself, because he, in fact, had divided Japanese politics and society so deeply, and occasionally through his attitude use of political power to alienate the opponents and sometimes attack the opposite side, including opposition parties. And so naturally, Japanese society is still being divided, and so I think this is the first explanation. And secondly, the evaluation of Abe's sort of achievements have yet to be confirmed or finalized. And he has done, of course, so many good things, but there are also negative aspects of his political style from the point of view of Japanese democracy or so-called, the nationalistic agenda of his, and so forth. So his achievement is still mixed, and its evaluation has yet to be finalized. And I think that's another background behind the divided response to Kishida's decision to hold the state funeral.
Right, I see. Professor Kim, beyond the domestic conflict there in Japan, on the diplomatic front, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo will be sitting down with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for talks on the sidelines of the state funeral. What are the broader implications, if I may, of these frequent interactions between Seoul and Tokyo?
Yeah, I think as Professor Soeya mentioned, South Korean Yoon government is very eager to make the relationship better. And I think the two folds. First, emotionally, South Korean government is trying to increase the levels of interactions and numbers of interactions so that Japanese and South Korea's emotional animosity towards each other would decrease. But on the other hand, at the same time, I think they are trying to make more detailed distortions straighten out, trying to find solutions. That is not very easy now, but I think as far as the emotional animosity is concerned, interactions on many levels, summit level and prime minister level and minister level, I think they are very important, especially young generations. They are very friendly towards each other culturally and academically. Japan-Korea relationship is much better than older generations. So I think still we have some historical legacy that needs to be solved out, and that's the homework that needs to be solved by this government in detail.
Right, indeed, of course. Professor Soeya, on the national front there in Japan, how does the divided public response perhaps to Mr. Abe's legacy look to affect Prime Minister Kishida and his administration's agenda?
Well, in my personal observation, Prime Minister Kishida himself has been a bit over sort of wary, too much wary of the legacies of the conservative politics. And the decision to hold the state funeral, I think, was the very symbolic decision of his. He tried to please conservative politicians and the conservative atmosphere of the Japanese society, but the decision was a bit too hasty, and reportedly Kishida himself repented, about his decision. But of course, he could not revert to not to hold it, and so maybe this would be hopefully the last sort of chance for him to sort of get over the legacies of Prime Minister Abe. Of course, he will inherit some positive things, but he will have to sort of restructure, reorganize sort of fundamental policy lines of Abe, including, in my view, Abenomics. I think some of our problems we have now economically in Japan, I think have some roots in Abenomics. And of course, this is a very difficult task, but Kishida has to do it. And in foreign policy, dimension, Kishida is known as a liberal, politician, and I think that is correct. And I think he himself is very interested in improving relations with South Korea, but he has a very big baggage behind him. Legacy of Abe, and so this state funeral should be the last occasion for him to sort of, to pay attention to legacies of Abe too much and bring things back to his own preferences.
Right. And Professor Kim, keeping in mind what Professor Soeya has just said, with regard to ties between South Korea and Japan, what do you propose to better improve bilateral relations?
I think, the most imminent issue is encashment issues, encashment of seized assets of Japanese companies. The Supreme Court of Korean Supreme Court decided and verdicted that about the forced labor issues and reparations, decided at the Supreme Court. But as the Japanese companies did not, coalesce with the decisions, another verdict was that, encashment of seized assets of Japanese companies should be implemented. But I think this is very critical event. If it is encashed, normalizing the relationship between Japan and Korea will be much more difficult. And South Korean government made the decision to be postponed and now working with a joint committee between public and private sectors of South Korea. But I think what didn't go very well, and maybe the decision so far is to make the third organization to be the subject to make another funding and things like that. But I think more important thing is that even though it is not a South Korean government or Japanese government, but a third organization, there should be still a minimum level of apologies by Japanese government that is requested by the forced laborers So I think that's the key issues. And yeah, I think that the two governments are, discussing these key issues. So I hope that there will be some solutions on this.
All right. Hopefully, we'll keep our fingers crossed for a proper solution to the bilateral relationships and an improvement, perhaps, in the very near future. All right, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Soeya, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.